Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey friends, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Rural Woman podcast this year, and we are taking a look back through the inspiring stories that have been shared with us throughout the years. Looking back through these interviews, there are women who have been successful, who have persevered, and who have been resilient. There are women who have shared their stories who may not farm or ranch or homestead or work in the business that they used to. Things may be different for them now, but I know their stories have impact. And I hope that this is a solid reminder for those of you who have shared your stories or who are inspired to share your stories. Our stories are forever changing. And just because we may not farm, ranch, or homestead the same, our lives might not look the same. There has been growth here. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it's a solid reminder for all of us to look back to see how far we've come. So my friends, I hope you enjoy these throwback podcast episodes coming your way, and thank you for being here and for helping me celebrate the incredible stories of women in agriculture through the Rural Woman podcast over the last 5 years. Enjoy. Andrea, Elias, how about you tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from?
Okay. My name is Andrea. I am from South Central Manitoba, and I manage a large farrow to finish daughter nucleus hog farm out here.
So, Andrea, what do you think some of the biggest challenges you face in your day-to-day operations are?
Biggest challenges? Well, I guess a lot of the time when you get mechanical breakdowns or even like weather-related things that you can't control, right? So we have a big boiler system running our barn. If something goes wrong with that boiler system, that can affect the entire facility. So the mechanical things, the fans all of a sudden not working, or like you say, the feed lines breaking down or anything like that, those are always challenges. Luckily, I have staff that are incredible at fixing things. Like, I am so blessed to have staff that are so mechanically inclined, because if I had to fix a fan, I would not be able to do stuff like that. So I am really, really happy that I have the guys there to help me with that kind of stuff. Yeah, fixing auger flighting is not my strength, but they're always there to help. So mechanical issues for sure. And, you know, sometimes health things, you do get bugs that will come through. It's not It's no surprise that, pigs can get the flu, pigs can get a cold. It does happen. And then sometimes that does become an emergency because, we need to address this. We need to do something with it. So that is another thing that can become an emergency. And usually staff is pretty good, but every once in a while, staff issues do arise, and they obviously need to be dealt with in a timely manner, and to make sure that we keep our team solid and work together. So I'd say those are basically some of the biggest day-to-day ones.
So Caiti, for those of my listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us a little bit about who you are and where you're from.
Well, I am Caiti Pierce. Currently, we live in northern Wisconsin. We're about an hour and a half from the UP, an hour and a half north of Green Bay, so kind of in the middle. And our family, we have 3 children. Emma is our oldest, and then Eddie and Henry. And my husband, Ben, he works full-time at Silver Birch Ranch as the equine director. So he takes care of the horses and leads trail rides for campers all year long in the Nicolet National Forest. But on the side, we have a grass-fed, grass-finished beef business. That's like a tongue twister. And we started about 5 years ago, more officially raising grass-finished beef. We were doing it more on the side before that. And we have dabbled in all sorts of things. We've done hogs. We've done sheep, meat chickens. We've kind of tried our hand at different things, and we've really settled on the grass-finished beef as our main focus and what we truly enjoy doing and really see growing and advancing down the road.
Why did you guys choose to go the grass-fed, grass-finished beef?
Well, in all transparency, the year Ben bought the first bunch of he bought a small herd of Scottish Highlands from someone else. And that year was 2012. And if I remember correctly, corn prices were really high. And since we had just bought 5 cattle, which it was like on the radar, but those things happen usually faster than you can save money for. So we just weren't in a place then to shell out for corn. We were also on the side, we would buy bull calves from the local dairy. And a lot of dairies, they will raise their bull calves on grain. And we had done that in the past, but that year we were like, well, let's just try. Let's just save some money and raise these animals without corn. It takes longer, especially since when we were raising just Scottish Highlands and then these, dairy calves, it took a very long time. But once we got one in the freezer and we tried it and we raised another one for another family, they really liked the taste. There's this misconception it's dry, it has no flavor, or maybe it tastes too gamey. But if you raise it long enough and with good quality hay, it's not going to taste like that. But a lot of people also have, your palate. If you prefer the taste of corn-fed versus grass-fed, you will taste that difference. So really the reason why we started raising grass-finished was just for money reasons. And then we realized there was a niche out there. People wanted grass-finished beef. So we just kept going.
For my listeners who are unfamiliar with Tiffany Duncan, tell us a little bit more about who you are and where you're from.
Well, like you said, I'm Tiffany Duncan. I am from the East Coast, based in Nova Scotia. I grew up a blueberry farmer and kind of got lucky enough that both of my parents had land. And I've spent every summer in the fields working with them in Oxford, Nova Scotia, which is most commonly known as the world capital of blueberries, wild blueberries. And now I live in the Annapolis Valley.
So tell us more about your background as a blueberry farmer. That's pretty interesting, and especially that it's the capital of the world where you live with all of these blueberries. So tell us more about that side of you, the blueberry farmer.
Yeah, so wild blueberries, which most people see the high bush berries fresh in grocery stores. The high bush berries are the nice big round plump berries. Blueberries have a very short production time, and they are most commonly frozen because they retain nutrients really well when they're frozen, and they're so versatile. But yeah, we basically harvest, and Oxford is one of the largest processors of berries as well. We have a lot of small farms around and some fairly large ones as well, but they basically flash freeze everything and ship it. So wild blueberries are most commonly found in your supermarkets. Yeah, that's about it.
Kelly Sidoryk, tell us about who you are and where you're from.
Well, as you said in the intro, I ranch with my family near Lloydminster. We're on the Alberta side, but close to the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. We also have an operation east of Spiritwood, so that's it's not too far from here.
And how did you get your start in agriculture? Were you born into it or were you married into it?
I was born into it. My family had a feedlot operation still on the same location-ish where we are now, and that was started by my dad and his partner in 1963.
So it was in your blood.
Mm-hmm.
So for the listeners who may not be familiar, what is holistic management?
Well, as you said, it's a decision-making process framework that takes into account the land and the livestock, the people, and the finances. So it's based on your own unique operation and the values that you have for your family and your team. So there's a number of different principles that people apply differently.
What are some of the most positive effects that you've seen for your land and animals using holistic management?
Well, certainly over the years, the diversity and the health of our land has improved. And as many people in the audience know, that certainly translates into the production with the animals. So when we think about the amount of resilience and biodiversity and production that we can get off the land with just using the cattle as a tool with very little inputs, it's been significant.
Right. And what do you think some of the positive effects have been on the people side of it?
Well, I have to first say that we are like every other family, that sometimes things go great and sometimes they don't go so great. I've shared a slide recently with showing the royal family that, even they're having trouble getting things on track.
I've heard
but
that.
I think, certainly the piece about inclusivity and trying to include everybody in the conversations, trying to do our best to have better communication and paying attention to what the members of our family is for how they envision the operation in the future. Because, frankly, it's going to be them taking it forward, not necessarily us.
Tell the listeners who you are and where you're from.
My name is Tammy. My last name is Thielman, and I am a farmer and counselor. And I live in the interior of British Columbia in a place called Salmon Arm.
Salmon Arm is probably one of the most beautiful places.
2 words.
Yes. Yeah. It's so beautiful.
It's known as a very popular kind of tourist area with mountains and trees, and I feel very lucky to live here.
What made you decide that you wanted to go into the field of psychology? You were raised a farmer, you married a farmer, you're still a farmer, but why did you want to do this?
Yes. Well, I think, it just kind of takes me back to when I first discovered your podcast. All I knew was growing up on a farm as a girl, but, many of my friends grew up on farms, and I grew up in a very kind of small town, both at the coast when I was really quite young. I was in a dairy farming area where my dad's family is from in the Fraser Valley. And then we moved to the interior, and, farms, they look so beautiful and it's a beautiful setting and environment, but families can still struggle. And our family went through a traumatic time when I was a teenager. Sadly, my parents divorced and we ended up having to sell our farm. We lost that connection we had with some of our really special animals at a really critical time. And I went through some struggles as a teen. And, I think I just always had a lot of compassion and ultimately really a calling to really help support folks going through difficult times, even though it might not look like it on the outside. And I think that really ties in with agriculture, that even though, families or individuals live in the country and live on a farm, it doesn't mean that we're immune to some of the really stressful things and traumatic things that happen in life.
You can help support the stories of women in agriculture to be shared through the Rural Woman podcast on Patreon. What is Patreon? It's a membership-based platform that helps fund and support creators like me to create and produce content like this that you all love. New to the Rural Woman podcast Patreon is ad-free listening and patron-only bonus content and exclusive episodes. Learn more and join the patron gang today at patreon.com/The Rural Woman Podcast. For my listeners who are unfamiliar with Mel Gallup, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from.
Okay. Obviously, Mel Gallup. I'm from Goodling, Idaho. I live on a rural farm. I'm married to a veterinarian. I am a nurse by career, and we run our own commercial herd, and that's about who I am. I have two boys, 13 and 11, that help us out, and we all work as a team to make things go. And so that's kind of who we are.
So you mentioned your soap making. So tell us more about your business.
Yeah. So my little venture in soap making, it started back when I was actually doing some home health in nursing. And if anybody out there that does nursing, they know how stressful it can be. And I just needed a creative outlet. I've been creative all my life. And I just wasn't getting that satisfaction out of the nursing. Nursing is very, to the point, and this is what you need to do. And there's not a lot of room for error or adjustment. So anyway, I started looking at something maybe to try to fill that void for me and give me some stress relief. And I found a really pretty bar of soap on Pinterest. And that's where it all started. I says, well, heck, if they can make it, so can I. So I'm an entirely self-taught soaper. I tried to reach out a couple times to people that made soap, and I didn't realize that there's a saying in nursing that nursing eat their young. Obviously, soap makers can eat their young too. So I just had the determination to make it myself. And then also I looked at it and I really wanted to support the agricultural world. And I was looking at my cows and the stuff that actually, with just a custom farm butcher, there's a lot of stuff that if you don't want it, it just goes to the trash. So I decided that there was going to be one less thing going to the trash on our animals, and it was the beef tallow, the beef fat. So I ended up just doing research and rendering it down myself. And that's how I truly got started with my soap. Is something I wanted to honor my farmers, my ranchers, and my home gardeners. And it's amazing what you can't put in a bar of soap that doesn't come off the land.
Kate Estrade. For my listeners who are unfamiliar with you, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from.
Awesome. So I'm Kate. My husband, Grant, and I have a small, diversified livestock operation about 65 miles north of New Orleans. I'm actually from Wisconsin originally. And while I grew up in a rural area surrounded by row crops and dairies, and my parents had a big vegetable garden every year, and we composted and went to the farmer's market, I never would have imagined pursuing farming as a actual vocation or profession.
Now I wanted to get into the regenerative ag and soil health. So tell us about some of the practices that you do to promote regenerative ag and healthy soils on your farm.
Yeah, so we just kind of try to look to how these animals behaved in nature and what their benefits were to nature. So, if you have pigs in one area, lots of poop, and with their long, powerful snouts, like very destructive, they'll make a lake for themselves. But if you look at them as sort of like nature's rototillers and use them appropriately and move them constantly, then, they're not a nuisance. They don't have to be kept on concrete to keep them from digging to China. So, so we're sort of like pigs root, chickens scratch, cattle graze, goats browse/graze. And all of them have positive effects to the ecosystem and the soil when you're managing them in that way. So during the grazing season, we're moving the cattle and the goats pretty much every day to a new grid because we want them in a small enough area that they're going to eat everything more evenly. They have a sense of competition with each other. So then, they're eating their favorite plants and their less favorite plants. And then that helps keep all of the pasture in what we call like the blaze of growth, like the teenage blaze of growth. So the plants will kind of draw down more carbon and keep growing fast if they're not like way down to the ground where they're back like in infancy, or if they're not let to grow and put out seed heads and get into their like reproductive phase. And that's why, even though the goats are maddening sometimes, we've kept them as we've gotten the pasture to a better quality to actually be able to graze cattle. Whereas we weren't, when we got the land, it was like very depleted soil and just lots of shrubby blackberry and goldenrod and stuff that wasn't really to the quality that cattle would eat.
Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from.
Well, I'm Kim Goodling, and I'm a shepherd to a flock of Gotland sheep. And our farm is in central Vermont. And we started out as a homestead and raised 3 children. And along the way, we decided that we had actually moved from being a homestead to a full-fledged farm.
That is a lot of work and a big transition. So what led you into wanting to be a sheep farmer?
Well, that's a real good question. I'm not sure I have an exact answer. I remember one night when I was in my midlife, and I remember saying to my husband, when I get to the end of my life, I don't want to have regrets. I don't want to say, what if? I want to feel like I lived, that I had done everything I wanted to do. And I don't want to get there at the end and, feel sad that my time on this earth is over, but there's so much I wish I had done. And he sat there and looked at me and he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, let's get sheep. And honestly, I have no idea where that came from. It just came out. And he's like, okay, that sounds awesome. Let's do it, So that really was our start. And we spent, I would say, 1.5 years really researching before we ever purchased sheep. And we went to every sheep and wool festival. I sat through every single course and class and what that was out there just to learn as much as we could. And finally he was the sheep specialist for our state extension services, and he was on our property, and he looked at me and said, Kim, would you quit asking me questions and just go get your sheep? And I'm like, oh, do you think I'm ready? He's like, yes, just go do it. And I thought, I will do it. So, that was it. I was not a knitter. I didn't know anything about wool. I had never owned sheep. I'd hardly seen sheep. So it wasn't like I had this lifetime love of little lambs or anything,
For the listeners who have been listening for a very long time, the name Richelle Barrett should ring a bell for you. But for the listeners who are unfamiliar with who you are, tell us a little bit more about yourself and where you're from.
Okay, so I am from Haverford, Montana. So we are about 40 miles south of the Canadian border, kind of in north central Montana. And I raised cattle with my husband, and I grew up on my family's ranch where we currently live and work with my parents. So that's kind of a little about me. I'm a writer and a blogger, and I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell.
We have been connected for quite some time now and have honestly written some beautiful pieces that have made me weepy. They have made me happy. They've made me mad for you and with you. So tell us more about your blog, The Prairie Crocus.
Okay. So I started writing kind of when my kids were probably toddlers. My oldest was probably 4, maybe 5. And I had a really good friend at my job who had a blog, and she's an awesome writer. And we just kind of were always talking about writing and these different things. And she just was like, you have the funniest things that you post on Facebook. You need to share those. And I was like, no, nobody's going to read them, And so her constant prodding and some of my other friends prodding me, I had a different page. And at the time, I think it was called like Blue Skies. And so I was writing stories about my kids and writing stories about just kind of ranch life and putting up my pictures about cows and horses and everything for kids. And just kind of a lot of it was really silly stuff and then hard mother stuff, that we all kind of go through when our kids are that age. And then over time, it just kind of has grown into more of this. What changed into Crocus was more, I wanted it to be more encompassing. My life's just not just red cows and blue skies, and so it kind of, the Prairie Crocus is my favorite part. And so I kind of think of, like on my actual website, it says bloom where you're planted. And I just kind of feel like you kind of have to do what you can where you are with what you have. So over time, it's changed from talking about the kids and how toddlers are difficult to things that I'm really passionate about, whether that's trying to advocate for the beef industry and, trying to tell our story as young ranchers in agriculture, or maybe it's sharing some silly poem or something, just kind of whatever hits me that day. I rarely ever post. It's all like what hits me at the moment. So it's really grown in the last year, and I never expected it to become something that so many people could relate to. But it makes me so happy when people send me messages and they're like, oh my gosh, I just love this. And, I can relate to this, or I went through this when I was a kid and I've been off place for so long. But it just brings back memories, especially brings back memories of a loved one that's gone. And it's just so awesome to think that my words can connect with so many.
For my listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us a little bit of information about who you are and where you're from.
Okay. Well, my name is Deanne Frieders, and I am my husband, Ryan. There's 4 kids ranging from ages 16 down to the age of 4. And we farm here in Northern Illinois. We're in a small community, Waterman, Illinois. And we're about 60 miles west of Chicago. So beyond the suburbs, and then you get out to where the farm ground is. And I have been working from home since our daughter Eleanor, who is now in kindergarten, was born. And luckily, we've got my parents living 5 minutes in one direction and his parents living in 5 minutes the other direction. So we're kind of nestled in between our families.
What advice or words of encouragement do you give to a new or current farm mom?
It's easy to be enamored by the farm life, right? You come into it and it just, there's the smell of the soil and, you see, how when you're farming, you have to really love what you're doing to be good at it. And I really think as a farm mom or a farm wife, you have to kind of come in and realize it is long hours, but they are worth it. I think the trade-offs and the values that you get in raising a family this way, having the kids be able to come along and, ride in the tractor on occasion, or having them, just goes into a farm or raising livestock. I think those are great things. But also with it comes, like I said, some different lifestyle aspects. And my standard response when we get invited to pretty much anything when it's during planting or harvest is, I don't know. It depends on the weather. Like when it's my niece's birthday party, I'm always saying, I don't know if there's going to be one of us there or if there will be 6 of us there, because it just depends on, a lot outside of ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think the word flexibility comes to mind when I think of farm families and events off of the farm. I know there are definitely times where I have gone to family functions by myself, and I think some people actually don't think I actually have a husband, but I promise he's there, but he is in the field.
Right. And, for me, honestly, I used to be really almost, I would say, beyond disappointed. It used to just be heartbreaking for me. But once I came to realize and accept that that's part of how this life operates, it's become much easier. You take the good with the bad, and, I'm lucky when I come home from going to those events by myself or with the kids by myself, he's going to lay in bed next to me. And so I'm lucky in that way.
So Leslie, for my listeners, give us a little bit about who you are and where you're from.
Sure. Well, my name is Leslie Svacina, and I own and run a grass-based livestock farm called Cylon Rolling Acres near Deer Park, Wisconsin, and that's in western Wisconsin. So if you are not as familiar with our part of the country, we are about an hour east of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and I'm raising meat goats on pasture, and our goats are raised specifically for meat, for eating purposes. And so my husband and I bought our farm in 2011, so almost 9 years ago now that we purchased the farm, and a few years after that, I started raising goats.
I know I've seen on Instagram one of the restaurants locally to you that uses your meat in their restaurants, and as well, you cook your own goat meat. So I'm interested to know, what are some of your favorite ways of eating goat meat?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm still learning, but one of the ways that we've eaten goat a lot is in a curry. And so there's a Thai curry recipe that I've been on a kick for a while, but then we also have Euro meat made, so I often like to eat Euros. And then I've got a number of other recipes that are kind of on my list that I'd like to try, of some different other more curries, but then also, there's some different goat burger and some different types of grilled shanks and chops. But it kind of ebbs and flows when we eat goat at home, just because of what's available for us to sell. So it depends on what I have in the freezer, or if I have some stock that is left over, let's say from the previous year, that's when I know I get to do some more recipe, trying out new recipes, whether it's adapting other ones. And one of the other resources that I have really found to love for enjoying learning how to cook goat and experimenting with different types of cultural cuisines is the cookbook Cooking and Eating by James Wetler. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he published a great goat cookbook maybe a year and a half ago. But he coordinates Goattober, the October goat meat month internationally. So that's a great resource and a fun resource that I've been learning to cook from.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Blaystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story.